So in one sense, the reviewers, Dame Patsy Reddy and Sir Michael Cullen, appear to have been clarifying anomalies and confusions arriving from the government's own GCSB amendment bill in 2013. And as Sir Michael Cullen told me earlier, that bill was confusing about the GCSB's powers to intercept the private communications of New Zealanders.
Well, on the face of it, it says you can't. The law behind that very largely says you can. But in fact, the confusion is such that the GCSB has determined that it's not legally safe for them to act, even when the safety and security, immediate safety and security of a New Zealander is at stake. And in fact, there's been some quite serious examples in that regard. So it's much better to start with a clean slate and say this really is not rational. The rational thing is to say, if we're targeting New Zealanders, first of all, it should be on the utmost grounds of national security, not for these broader things like international well-being and economic well-being and so on. Secondly, you've got a double lock in terms of the approval from the Attorney General and the Judicial Commissioner. And thirdly, you've got to meet tests of necessity, proportionality. There's no less intrusive means of gathering information and so on. And finally, that you've got very strong oversight capacity and powers on the part of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security.
Nonetheless, you do have an expansion of the GCSB's powers in literal terms, don't you? And if we go
not
back...
Not really, John. That's the problem.
But if you look at the GCSB Amendment Act 2013 and you look at Section 14, it says, and I quote, "In performing the Bureau's function," in Section 8B, the Director, any employee of the Bureau, any person acting on behalf of the Bureau must not authorise or do anything for the purpose of intercepting the private communications of a person who is a New Zealand citizen. Now that's going to change, isn't it? That's going to change.
But the problem with that, John, is that that's what it says on the face of Section 14. You then have to go to the definitions clause and look at the definition of what a private communication is, which I've just run through. And I don't think you can seriously argue that if you're engaged in planning a terrorist act, you can have a reasonable expectation you're not going to have your communications monitored. Secondly, there's an exception if you're an agent of a foreign power, which is also a very wide definition under current legislation, which we are proposing should be severely narrowed. For example, in the case of Kim.com...
The point is, sorry, I just want to come back to 2013. The point is that when people said, gosh, there are so many exceptions, this legislation is effectively meaningless, they were dismissed, and I've got the Prime Minister's own words from the third reading, taken from Hansard, as misinformation and conspiracy theories. In other words, the people who said back at the time, this licenses you to spy on New Zealanders, were right. What you're now doing, I guess, is formalising that, aren't you?
No, not really, not at all. Because, as I said, the SIS has the capacity to monitor New Zealanders. I mean, essentially what you're really trying to argue, John, when you argue that you shouldn't have those coherent, combined, consistent powers, is that you're going back to playing cricket without Snicko and Hawkeye. Because the SIS's capacities, obviously, are older generation by and large. The GCSB's is more recent generation technology. That's what GCSB basically is. It is a technology. And how do you use that technology in a way consistent with a free, open and democratic society? And I don't think, John, one could seriously argue, I mean, I think it's an impossible position to argue, that if somebody really is engaged in planning a serious terrorist action, one shouldn't be using those capacities of the GCSB to try and prevent that terrorist action.
Except weren't they the reassurances we were given? In other words, you are now making rational, cohesive, persuasive arguments around a playing field that had already shifted. And I wonder if that's why people are mistrustful of this process.
No, I mean, it's not for me to comment about what was said or done by various people in 2013 and 2014. Patsy Reddy and our concern was to look at the very muddled nature of our current legislation, because the acts have quite different origins, quite different timings. The SIS Act still bears the hallmarks of starting in the age of the Cold War. The GCSB Act pretty much bears its markings in the actual act being passed soon after the 9/11 terrorist activity in New York. We need to start from a clean slate and to recognise, for example, that the kind of actions we're talking about don't just come from Islamist groups. They can come from a wide variety of people, as the Norwegians learned only a couple of years or so ago. And I don't want to misinterpret as saying this, the people engaging in them believe they're doing it in a just cause. I mean, they are not purely evil people. They believe there's a just cause in which they are working for. They're just profoundly wrong-headed, sometimes about the cause and always about the means they're using.